You grab one of the handouts. You know where the copy is. It's in the church office. You go to that. That's pretty obvious. Thank you so much.
That sounds like
Okay, well, 5 past, so go ahead and kind of get us started here. So last week, if you kind of take a look at the top of your notes for today, you have that general outline of the book of Revelation. And last week we looked at the there are more coming. I sent somebody to kind of print out some more handouts. So I thought 50 would be enough, but I guess maybe more than 50. So which is a good problem, I guess, to have. So, but there'll be more handouts very shortly, and I'll try to signal to Tim when he gets back who needs a handout. So I'll ask for a show of hands. But for now, if you can kind of practice the good Christian gift of charity and sharing, kind of make do with the copies that we have. So if you have a handout, or if your partner, your neighbor has a handout, you take a look here at the top of the page of handouts. You see the general outline Revelation. Last week we looked at the cycle of 7 trumpets, which looks at God's redemptive historical administration of both judgment and justice with respects to the fate of unbelievers. That's kind of in contrast to how his administration of his purposes are played out with respect to the fate of God's people in the previous cycle of 7 seals. We saw that both of them are a cycle of 7 that are kind of implementing and bringing into effect the rule and reign of Christ as it was figured in the vision of the throne room in Revelation 4 and 5. So today we're going to be moving on in the book of Revelation now to really what is the beginning of the second half of the book, which begins with a unnumbered set of 7 visions of deep conflict. Now the reason why they're not numbered in terms of there's the first vision, here's the second vision, right? We've seen that kind of pattern so far, at least with the seals and the trumpets. We see that this next set of 7 is not numbered because it is this kind of programmatic set of visions that are kind of setting the same kind of tone that the visions in chapters 4 and 5 set for the 7 visions of the seals and the trumpets. So you think about this next set of 7 visions that are unnumbered are kind of playing the same kind of role that chapters 4 and 5 played in Revelation. Now my trusty assistant here, Tim, has got some handouts. If you need a handout, please raise your hand. He can hand you one as we continue on here. And so it's not numbered for the sake of kind of issuing that same kind of function. We'll see here that the 7 bowls and the judgments that follow are putting into effect are kind of bridging off of what we see going on, what's being established here in the 7 visions. We'll also notice that the reason why we have a new half of the book here is it's following right on the heels of this recommissioning of John as this end-time prophet. Notice that the whole of chapter 10 was a vision that kind of figured John's responsibility, kind of being recommissioned as a prophet to prophesy, as the end of chapter 10 says here, as you must again prophesy about many peoples, nations, languages, and kings. So halfway through the book, John is recommissioned now. Once he's kind of related the 7 cycles of the seals and trumpets key to Revelation 4 and 5 and the vision of the throne room, now he's being recommissioned with a new kind of programmatic vision, according to which the 7 bowls and the subsequent visions are going to be key to those visions as well. Think about the book of Revelation having these 2 halves. Now we're getting into that second half with the 7 visions. But before we do that, we wanted to wrap up our kind of discussion of the 7 trumpets with this last kind of interlude vision we saw about the 2 witnesses. If you look at chapter 11, that's the kind of other half of the interlude that is placed between the 6th and the 7th trumpet. We saw a similar structure to that last time we looked at the seals, where between the 6th and the 7th seal, you had something of an interlude that helps interpret the significance of that cycle of 7. So here we're looking at chapter 10 was a recommissioning of John the prophet, so we're getting kicked up ready for the second half of the book. And then we see chapter 11, again, a vision that interprets the kind of what's true of God's people as God is bringing judgment upon unbelieving humanity during the current age, but also getting us ready for the deep conflict visions that can speak to the truth of what's happening behind the scenes. So chapter 11 is very much is kind of a chapter in between these 2 halves of the book of Revelation. Now, looking at chapter 11, we can't read the whole thing for the sake of time, but we can summarize its basic contents in the following way. In the beginning of chapter 11, John is told to measure the temple of God, the altar, and all who worship there. And in doing this, John is told not to measure the court outside the temple. The reason given for this is that the court outside the temple is given over to the nations, who will trample the holy city for 42 months. Conversely, authority is granted to God's 2 witnesses to prophesy for 1,260 days. Now, if you're wondering what's the relationship between those 2 kind of sets of time, they're exactly the same. Right? 42 months, 1,260 days. They're both describing 3.5 years, which is a kind of a figurative metaphor throughout the book of Revelation, speaking of a short time. Right? So this 3.5 years, 42 months, 1,260 days. You see this one of these 3 different descriptions of this short period of time used throughout the book of Revelation. And again, just like most of the numbers in Revelation, they're not meant to be taken literalistically, but rather figuratively, describing the metaphor of a short period of trial or challenge. And so here we see that this time within the figuration of the book is describing this time between the 2 advents of Christ. Now let's take a look here. Now, why is John told to measure the temple of God, the altar, and all who worship there, but not to measure the court outside the temple? That's one question we want to ask ourselves. We'll come back to that question. As we kind of see the vision proceed, we see God's 2 witnesses prophesy effectively, bringing judgment upon their opponents in the various kind of significant forms. When their testimony is finished, the beast conquers and kills them, and their opponents celebrate and rejoice. Afterwards, the 2 witnesses are resurrected and ascended in the sight of their enemies, at which point a great earthquake and destruction ensues. So what are we to make about this particular vision? When we look at the temple being measured, there's lots of different ways that this kind of image has been interpreted in the past. Some interpreters that are kind of along what we call a futuristic kind of approach to the book, meaning that most of the book's contents is speaking about something in the future, understand it to be the literal rebuilt temple, or a third temple being rebuilt sometime in the future, and that those who worship in it are the remnant of believing ethnic Jews. So we have a literal third temple being built. We have the remnant of believing ethnic Jews residing or taking protection within the temple, whereas the unbelieving Jews at the time are in the court outside the temple, and henceforth they will be judged. Okay? So again, that's one kind of what we say a futuristic approach, or a literalistic approach towards the book. Another way of reading this text is what we kind of known as the preterist view, meaning that it approaches the book of Revelation as if everything that's been described here in this book has taken place before 70 AD. So when we see this image being described here in Revelation 11, again, it's a literalistic reading of the text, right? That's something that the preterist view has in common with a futurist view, is that they approach the book in a literalistic kind of reading. And because it's a literalistic reading, there has to be some kind of fulfillment of this event. If it's a literal temple that's being described and it's being destroyed, and this all happened before 70 AD, then this must be describing the destruction of the second temple in 70 AD when Rome came and sacked Jerusalem. Right, so those two approaches that are common to each other in the sense that they approach the image here in a literalistic fashion. But what we've seen throughout this book is that it's not using the imagery here in a literalistic manner. In fact, we remember from the very beginning of the book, right, when John receives these signs as they were signified to him, or communicated to him through symbols. Right? The first verse of the book of Revelation is telling us that read the book figuratively unless absolutely necessary. Right? So the idea here is that if the whole book is presenting this figurative language to be understood symbolically, our kind of modus operandi should approach this vision in the same kind of manner. So one, the general reading of the book of Revelation militates against an overly literalistic reading of the book. Even if we take that aside, even if we put that aside for a moment, it's clear that this figure, this kind of imagery here, is being borrowed and reappropriated from Ezekiel 40 through 48, which again itself was a figurative description of what the end-time presence of God's people in his temple presence is going to look like. We have in Ezekiel 40 through 48 not a literalistic description of the end-time temple, but a figurative description of the end-time temple. If you actually take the measurements of Ezekiel's temple in 40 through 48, you get this big, enormous, colossal kind of structure. And having features of it that are actually not materials that you would build a temple with, like water, certain types of water features, actually part of the structure of the temple. A lot of factors in Ezekiel 40 through 48 that can't be understanding to describe a literal temple, but rather describing what is the end time presence of God's people in his vicinity. What's that experience going to look like? In other words, the new creation is being described as an end time temple. And so Ezekiel 40 through 48 is the background here in terms of measuring the temple, which is supposed to signify God's protection of his people. Then we want to perhaps understand this passage just as well. The idea is that if Ezekiel 40 through 48 is using a figurative description of the end-time temple to talk about God's protection of his end-time people and the nature of the new creation, then we want to read this text in a similar manner. If he's employing Ezekiel in this way, we want to read the text accordingly, right? It's just basically a principle of you want to read a text according to its genre, right? You don't read a letter like a gospel. You don't read a gospel like a prophecy, right? So different genres call for a different reading strategy. And so here in Revelation 11, if we have the same language of Ezekiel 40 through 48 being employed, we want to read this text appropriately. And so that suggests to us that this should not be taken in a literalistic manner, but rather in a figurative manner. Plus, even if we put that aside, what problem would there be if we actually anticipate an actual, physical, reconstructed third temple that includes altar and also includes the regular practice of Levitical sacrifice? What big significant problem could be implied by that? Yeah?
Blasphemy?
Well, expand upon that.
Hebrews says to go back to that being blasphemous.
Right. Hebrews 10, right, is very clear that Christ's one-time sacrifice put an end to, right, the foreshadowing and forward-looking nature of the temple sacrificial system. So for that to be re-employed would seem to imply that Christ's one-time sacrifice wasn't one time and wasn't sufficient. So the idea that somehow there needs to be an eschatological temple, literally speaking, that reinstitutes the Levitical sacrifice would seem to go against the wider testimony of Scripture. Yeah?
How would dispensationalists answer that? How could we kind of give a rebuttal?
The response would be is that the sacrifices would be purely memorial, right? They would be purely kind of reflective of Christ's one-time sacrifice. The response to that is that nowhere else do we see any kind of festival or any kind of ritual that is instituted from the old covenant context to then memorialize Christ's sacrifice. What we find actually Christ instituting new rituals or new observances to signify the new nature of redemption that has been accomplished in his life, death, and resurrection and ascension. So what we don't see is we don't see the festal celebrations of Israel reinstituted. They're actually consolidated in now a new observance, namely the Lord's Supper. So we see those kinds of things throughout the Testament. We don't see, in a sense, a reversion back to old practices to somehow now be given new memorializing content. A similar kind of connection could be made to the idea that circumcision is not, very much so in Paul's mind, right, a requirement for Christian faithfulness. Because of the nature of baptism, circumcision is no longer has that effect or function within the covenant community. Right? Now, many dispensationalists might not accept that particular argument, but the truth does hold is that we don't see any other example of a reinstitution of Israelite practice now given new memorialistic content, except for perhaps this particular proposal. So again, it would fail with the lack of witness or any kind of supporting evidence elsewhere in Scripture. Yeah?
It's also due to the fact that all those festivals were directly interconnected with the temple.
Exactly.
You couldn't do those biblically without the temple. So because
Right.
the temple was literally destroyed, it loses all its meaning.
Yeah. And I think we do see in the Gospels, especially in the Gospel of John, where it's actually organized around a number of different festivals in the life of the Jewish calendar year. We see time and time again Christ is actually doing things that demonstrate himself to be the fulfillment of those festivals in John's Gospel. It's a great study if you ever have time to kind of track the different festivals in John's Gospel and notice how Christ fulfills each one of those festivals in his ministry of salvation. Yeah, so it's a great insight. And one other thing I want to point out here again, so if a literalistic or kind of biblicistic approach to Scripture, it characterizes this approach that doesn't acknowledge the Old Testament background, the same can be true for any kind of literalistic approach to this text. And unfortunately, that's another issue where it makes the preterist reading of this text problematic, because it depends on a literalistic hermeneutic for the text. It's actually something that a dispensational futurist and a preterist view has in common, is that they have to take this image literally to appropriate it to a pre-70 AD understanding of the book. So, kind of moving on from there. So what are we left with here? There's about three ways we could read this text. One is to kind of understand the image as figurative, but still describing a distinction between believing ethnic Jews and unbelieving ethnic Jews happening at the very end of the church age or redemptive history. Some interpreters that might see kind of an end-time massive conversion amongst ethnic Jewish people at the very end of the age might find evidence that for Romans 11. Again, that's not necessarily the only way you could read Romans 11, but some who would take that view find evidence here. One problem with that, though, and I think it's a significant problem, is that while it does understand the image figuratively, Revelation does not make a distinction anywhere else in the book between believing and unbelieving ethnic Jews. Any kind of Israelite language throughout the rest of the book of Revelation is not particular to a Jewish remnant, but it's expanded upon the entirety of God's people, right, during the Inter-Advent age. And so this would be the only place in the entire book, if we took it this way, that's talking about somehow that in the very end of the church age, that God is going to protect an ethnic believing Jews as opposed to the unbelieving Jews, who I guess would be represented by the outer court. So again, if this is speaking simply of God's purposes with respect to ethnic believing Jews in contrast to ethnic unbelieving Jews, it would be a distinction that Revelation doesn't make anywhere else when it uses Israelite language and metaphors. So if we don't go to that approach, there's two other possibilities. Either the inside of the temple are the believing, true, spiritual church, and the outer court is the professing but apostate church throughout history. It is that if God is measuring only a part of the temple, but then leaving the outer court to be destroyed by the trampling, invading Gentile armies here, the idea is that God is only protecting the true spiritual church rather than the visible or merely external church during the church age. So as God allows persecution and difficulty and suffering to fall upon the visible external church, the idea is that only the true church or the invisible church or that church that corresponds to the holiest of holy part of the temple is actually that's being measured and protected against being overcome by these kind of persecuting and oppressing and deceiving forces of Satan and his agents. That's one way you could read this text. Another way is to say that that this is not that the distinction between the outer court and the inner part of the temple is not a distinction between apostate versus spiritual church, but rather that there is a part of the church that is going to experience suffering and persecution to the point of actual martyrdom or death. So the idea is that God does preserve some of his church from this harm, but other parts of the church do experience the full brunt of tribulation, trial, and persecution. Now, the reason why some folks would take this particular reading as opposed to a distinction between the apostate and the true church is because when we read the rest of the vision, we only see two witnesses being talked about. Now, we might remember that throughout Revelation, visions are mutually interpreted. Right? Remember, we go back to Revelation 7. We had that vision of the 144,000, and then right on its heels, what was the vision after that 144,000?
Tribes, tongues.
Right, that's that great multitude from every tribe, tongue, nation, and people. And we understood that the mutually interpreting nature of those two visions is that God's true end-time Israelite people is of every tongue, tribe, nation, and people. We see this kind of mutual interpretive kind of function throughout the book of Revelation. And so if we have this vision of the temple that's followed by the vision of the two witnesses, it would seem to suggest that there's a kind of disjunction if the two parts of the temple are apostate versus spiritual. If the temple vision in Revelation 11 is supposed to be kind of interpreted or recapitulated by the vision of the two witnesses, right? Do you see the distinction there? Right? There's no representatives of the apostate church with respect to the two witnesses. So, again, some might read it here as not reflecting an apostate church being destroyed in the outer court while preserving the true church, but rather that certain parts of the church will feel the full brunt of satanic persecution and oppression, while some will actually be protected and preserved. The idea is that it's not going to fall upon the church equally. Some parts of the church will have an uneven reception of this oppression and persecution. Now I'm kind of on the fence between these two views, to be honest with you. Some days of the week, I'm, let's say, on the odd numbered ends days of the week, I'm on one view, and the even numbered days of the week, I'm on the other view. But I do think the latter view does have something to commend to it, not just because my PhD supervisor takes that view, but because you do have this mutually interpreting role between the two visions, between the two witnesses and the temples. Let me just pause there for a moment, maybe take any questions on it. That's our hand over here, yeah.
All right, so how are we getting from the last view
Yeah.
to the persecuted Christians then being saved?
Yeah, the idea is that they are delivered through their martyrdom. We'll see at the very end, we have this, the last part of this cycle is that we have the saints singing, right, in rejoicing of their vindication against the persecution of God's people by his enemies. So that's where their vindication or their victory ends up. It's not in their earthly experience.
Right.
It's in their resurrection, heavenly vindication. Yeah, great question. Any others on that point? Yes?
Just on measuring, you talk about like that God's people are taking refuge in the temple from the Gentile nations.
Mm-hmm.
But then you kind of talked about the measuring kind of equating to that, like with the larger context of them taking refuge. But like, can you talk about that a little bit? Like, what's the jump? What's the connection between measuring and protection?
Yeah, the idea is that throughout the Old Testament, in Ezekiel 40 through 48, you have the same instruction be given to the angel. That the angel is measuring out the different portions of the eschatological temple. And in that context, it's meant to describe its heavenly protection from outside forces. So what we see here going on in this vision is that in this vision of the temple itself is measured, but the outer court is not. And the idea here is that the outer court still being technically part of the temple structure, the idea is that God is going to give protection to part of the church, but some parts of the church will feel the full brunt of the trial and suffering and persecution of God's enemies. So the idea is it's borrowing that same significance of the measuring in Ezekiel 40 through 48 and using that same figure to communicate the same idea here. Does that help? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what we see happening with the two witnesses, again, notice that, yeah, one more question around here somewhere? Yes, yeah, one more question.
So, about the measuring of the temple, I know some, like as you said, some partial preterists would say that, like they would take an early view of the book because of that. And they would also say that if this book was written in 90 AD or sometime after that, how come John never mentions the temple being destroyed in this book? How would you respond to that?
Because he's not concerned about earthly geography. All of the geography in the book of Revelation is heavenly and spiritual geography. It's not meant to correspond to an actual kind of literal topography. So when you see saints in certain locations, there's a lot of telescoping that goes on. There's a lot of kind of mixed metaphors that go on. They're not necessarily taking the geography of Revelation as a kind of like, it's not an established video game map, right? The idea is that these different images and visions lay upon each other. And so the geography in Revelation is not kind of univocal, it's not one, but you have multiple geographies related to each particular vision. So you can't necessarily map out the entire Revelation as a unified geography. You have to take each vision cycle with its own geographical plane. And so in that sense, that would be the response to that, is that none of the geography here is necessarily supposed to be taken as a literalistic description of physical topography. Yes?
Along those lines, would you say that it, likewise with biology in Revelation and other prophetic books, where the analogy or animals being described are particular to that particular vision, not across? Like you have a lion being good in one vision, a lion being bad in one vision, you have things like that.
Yeah, possibly, yeah, sure. I don't get too far afield, but yeah, generally speaking, yes.
Yeah.
All right, so really quick here, so we gotta get to the 7 visions here. All right, so you look at the rest of chapter 11 here, and you see that the behavior of the two olive trees, the 2 lampstands, which are the 2 witnesses, right? So Here, you've got these two witnesses identified as two olive trees, two lampstands. Again, this is meant to be carrying over that image back from chapters 2 and 3, right? These are the two remaining faithful churches. Right? It's not necessarily saying that all the other churches definitely kind of, went sideways, but it's significant that there's only two completely, totally faithful churches in Revelation 2 and 3, and we have a reappropriation of that image to talk about the faithful church during this time of persecution of God's people between Christ's two advents. And we see that the ministry and the vocation of these two witnesses as representing the witnessing and testifying church is to be able to kind of call down all these different judgments. And notice that these judgments are reappropriations of things that Moses did and things that Elijah did. That's significant. Again, so the idea here is that the imagery or the metaphor is that just as Moses was a faithful testifier and witness to God's rule and reign, as was Elijah, we see that the church is equally successful in its prophetic ministry. Just like Moses, just like Elijah, because the church is in Christ, the prophet, priest, and king. Right? That same kind of end-time prophetic gifting of the Spirit is employed and exercised by the church's witnessing ministry. So in the preaching of the word, in the administration of the sacraments, in the evangelization of the lost, right, the church is successful and effective in its latter-day prophetic activity. Right? So its witness is bringing judgment upon the unbelieving audience. Right? The fire and the plagues here are not describing literalistic events, but rather what's going on spiritually when the unbelieving world hears the testimony of the church and is confronted with the message of the church and the gospel and rejects it. Right? It's not an announcement of salvation to them, it's an announcement or a securing of their judgment. Just as when Christ taught in parables, right? It's for those who know the mystery of the kingdom of God to understand the parables and to apply them. But for those on the outside, right? They don't understand the parables. It's a word of judgment to them. So similar thing going on here, that the faithful, effective ministry of the church does kind of harden and ultimately bring spiritual judgment upon unbelieving audience of fallen humanity. All right, there's a lot of other things going on in Revelation 11 here. I'll have to skip over them. If you want to ask questions, you can ask after class. That's the general gist of what's going on here in Revelation 11. Okay, so we've got the 7 visions of deep conflict, and I have them listed out here for you in your handout. Hopefully, if you don't have a handout, we might have some extras left from the second set. But the 7 visions here, and I'll kind of just go through them really quickly, is that first we have the vision of the woman and the dragon. That's in chapter 12. We have the vision of the beast from the sea in the first half of chapter 13. We have the vision of the beast from the land in the second half of chapter 13. Then we have the vision of the Lamb standing with the 144,000 at the beginning of chapter 14. We have the 3 angels with an eternal gospel in the latter portion of chapter 14, followed by the Son of Man and the harvest of the last day, which is then concluded with the saints singing the song of Moses by the glass sea. Now again, these 7 visions are unnumbered because they aren't key to a preceding vision. They themselves are the programmatic vision that the bowls and the subsequent visions are going to appropriate what they describe. So let's kind of go through these each in order here and kind of unpack what we're seeing here. Now, the vision of the woman and the dragon can be summarized basically here as a result of Christ's victory over the devil, God protects the church against the devil's wrathful harm. And this truth is seen from 3 different vantage points. If you look at chapter 12, you can break it up into about 3 different sections. Verses 1 through 6 describe how God's people have been continually protected from being undone by satanic persecution throughout redemptive history. All right, so verses 1 through 6 kind of go all the way back to even before Christ and describe how God's people have been continually protected from being undone by satanic protection. In verses 7 through 12, we see that Christ's victory has secured Satan's defeat, making his now efforts futile. Right, so because of Christ's life, death, resurrection, and ascension, Satan's formally effective operation is now kind of permanently and terminally futile. And then verses 13 through 17, Satan's efforts to persecute and deceive God's people persist nonetheless, even though they are continually thwarted by God. Okay. So when we look at the first vision here, right, we see two signs that are described here. We see a sign of a woman and a sign of the dragon. Now we see that this woman here is described with a number of different features. Right? She's clothed with the sun, the moon is under her feet, and she has a crown of 12 stars. Now again, we can't chase down every single reference here, but the imagery that's being used here is being borrowed from mainly Joseph's vision, right, of his family, namely his parents, being represented by the celestial bodies of the moon, sun, and stars surrounding him that would all bow down to him. Here we see that this imagery, being borrowed mainly from Genesis 37:9, is describing Israel as a kind of whole, right? That she is clothed with the sun, the moon is under her feet, so you've got Jacob and his wife, kind of figured by the sun and the moon, and the crown of 12 stars, right, are the 12 tribes of Israel, right, figured by these 12 stars. We know that later on in other parts of Scripture, we see Israel described in connection with these celestial bodies as well. We get the Song of Solomon, chapter 6, Isaiah 60. Those are places as well that associate Israel with these celestial bodies. So the meaning of the image here, clearly, given its Old Testament background, is not meant to be a literalistic description of anybody currently living or living in the past, but rather is a figurative description of God's people as a whole, right, throughout redemptive history. Many kind of Catholic interpreters will famously go here to talk about that this is talking about Mary in particular, because later on she does give birth to a male child. But if we're understanding so much the powerful and significant role that the Old Testament plays in the book, we understand that John is meaning to figure here, not any particular person in history specifically, but rather describing the people of God as a whole, as being God's covenantal people. Now we see here that this woman here is confronted by a great red dragon with 7 heads, 10 horns, and 7 diadems. This description of 10 horns with 7 diadems being borrowed here from Daniel 7, again describing kind of the encapsulation of God's end-time opponents against his anointed. And so here we see Satan himself, the great dragon, being described in a similar kind of way. That he has an immense amount of earthly and worldly power, and he's using that against God's people. And we see here that in the course of this vision, a third of the stars of heaven are cast down to the earth. Now again, if we're kind of carrying forward the imagery that began the vision, the stars are not representing any kind of angelic beings, but they are kind of representative of the persecution of God's people. Right? If the 12 stars are on the crown of the woman, and Satan is kind of casting stars to the ground, this is an image of Satan buffeting this woman Israel and kind of persecuting her sons. So again, we can kind of look at a number of different places where the stars of heaven are associated with God's people in Daniel, and also borrowing from imagery that goes back to Genesis 15 and 22, again connecting with the tribes of Israel and the 12 and kind of star imagery, right? Your sons and descendants will be as what? The stars of the heavens. So the imagery here is one of Satan persecuting God's people throughout redemptive history, even before the time of Christ. We see that this woman gives birth to a male child who will rule the nations with a rod of iron. So again, this is alluding to Psalm 2, again with the son who rules over the nations with a rod of iron. The picture here is that the Messiah, right, the anointed one, is coming forth from this covenantal people. Right? She's being persecuted by God, by God's enemies throughout redemptive history, and kind of a culminating moment comes when she gives birth to the coming Messiah. We see that Satan attempts to kind of overcome this male child, but the male child is caught up to God and his throne, and the woman is fled into the wilderness. Here it's describing Christ's resurrection in victory. He ascends to God's throne. So Satan's apparent attempt to devour or to overcome Christ is defeated in the cross. And that's made evident by the fact that he is ascended or caught up to God in heaven. And subsequently, the church is fled into the wilderness to a place that's prepared by God, where she is nourished for 1,260 days. Again, when's the last time you saw God's people in the wilderness being nourished by God? Right? God, preservation of his people before they receive their full inheritance. So here at Christ's ascension and resurrection, once again the church is being preserved and protected during this time of trial and testing. For this short period of time between Christ's his resurrection and his second advent. We see the subsequent vision here of war in heaven between Michael and the dragon. Again, in the previous sign, we saw an earthly conflict, a conflict between the church and Satan, and Satan's persecution of the church throughout redemptive history, both before Christ and at his ascension. What we see now is another viewpoint of that conflict, not from an earthly point of view, but the heavenly kind of point of view. That Christ's victory is kind of being figured or described as the result of a heavenly war between Michael, kind of the chief of the angels, almost sometimes often being representative of God's people in Daniel. Here he's being seen again, issuing and commanding the same kind of function. Just as Michael was kind of the chief protector and vindicator of God's people in Daniel, so too now he's doing the same thing here. So his victory over Satan and his angelic forces are kind of a heavenly parallel to Christ's victory and ascension in the previous vision. Again, you can see a number of different connections here in the Old Testament where we're getting this kind of imagery. But here we see a heavenly picture of Christ's victory and Satan's defeat. And it's significant here because what it says here that no longer a place for them in heaven was found. Back in Daniel 2:35, this same phrase was used in the wake of the great stone that destroyed the multi-material image that described the coming kingdom destroying the present kingdoms of this world. So that after this stone destroyed that image, not a place or trace of those previous kingdoms were found. That same phrase, that same language is being repeated here to communicate the same idea. That with Satan being cast out of heaven, his former kind of role as being an accuser, right, as being a prosecutor, has now been made effectively null. Before Christ's death and resurrection, he had a case. He had a case. Think about it. If God continues to overlook our sin and to overlook our transgressions, Satan has a case to make. Why aren't you just, oh God, if you don't deal with sin, if you don't deal with these transgressions? But because Christ has died and has been raised to God's right hand, having received the full brunt of our punishment, Satan no longer has a case. So no longer does he have a place to make his argument. He's been cast out of the courtroom of heaven. He's been disbarred, so to speak, no longer able to practice heavenly law. And so we know that no longer can Satan's accusations or prosecutions of us actually have their effective goal. They've been canceled out and made null by Christ's death and resurrection. So that's the case. We know that to be the truth. But even so, even though that's the case, while his prosecutions and accusations will have no effect, they do persist nonetheless. Even though, heavenly speaking, they've been canceled out, we still will experience them, and we still will suffer their hard kind of knife-edge impact. But the idea is that even though God's efforts to persecute and God's people persist, they will be continually thwarted by God himself. That's really what's unpacked by the third kind of vision that we see here in verses 13 through 17. Let me just kind of stop there for a moment, just kind of pause. Any questions about this first vision here, what's being described and what's being articulated? The biggest takeaway we want to kind of gain from this is that while Satan has always persecuted God's people throughout redemptive history, this is nothing new. What's new now is that even though those persecutions continue, they can have no effect, and they have no legal standing before God anymore because of what Christ has accomplished in his cross and his resurrection. That's the great confidence that we can take from this particular vision. Any questions? All right, so let's go to the next vision here. So now the next vision here is the beast from the sea. And here it's paired with another beast that follows right on its tail. So I kind of want to look at these two visions in tandem. The first beast here, you can kind of summarize it here, is that believers are exhorted to be discerning about falsehood and not to participate in false worship propagated by the devil and worldly counterfeit kingdom power in order to hold on to their faith. You'll notice that that summary is almost carbon copied with the second beast, but there's a slight difference. Here, the charge or the lesson here is to be faithful, not just in the midst of worldly counterfeit kingdom power, but to be faithful in the face of worldly allied political, religious, and economic persuasion. So there's two images here, two beasts. And the two beasts will employ their two respective empowerments. They've been empowered by the dragon to persecute God's people in two distinct ways. One is to use raw, kind of stately or governmental power. You think about in terms of either political, military, or state power. In other words, we have actual kind of compulsion being described here. The exercise of brute, kind of realpolitik power used against God's people. The second beast is not describing the exertion of power, but rather the exertion of persuasion. So as the first beast seeks to either overcome, persecute, or deceive God's people by the exertion of his royal counterfeit power, the second beast seeks to do the same by the mode of persuasion. Right, so let me kind of unpack this for a moment. Now the first beast here, when we look at the identity of the beast, he's described with all of the trappings of the descriptions that we find of the four beasts of the four kingdoms in Daniel 7. Right, he's kind of an amalgam of those four different kingdoms. Now, why is this beast described in such a way? Here, John is not describing necessarily a particular individual figure at a particular point in historical time. Rather, he's talking about taking what's true of ungodly government and ungodly state power and ungodly forces throughout redemptive history as they span the entire moment of time. In other words, this beast is being described with all of the features of the four beasts of Daniel because it's a trans-temporal entity. It's a beast that's operative throughout redemptive history. So anytime that God's people experiences any kind of persecution or compulsion to apostatize from state powers or governments or forces, we have the beast of Revelation 13 at work. The exertion of his power is meant to deceive God's people that he is actually the holder of true kingdom royal power. Because not only is he described with the features of Daniel 7, notice his other features here. He's described as having certain types of horns. He's described as being as slain. He's described receiving a certain kind of worship. Who can defeat the beast, right? Who can fight against it? So what's significant about these kinds of descriptions? That he's featured with horns. He's featured with as being as slain, or appearing as if he was slain. He's receiving this kind of who is like unto the beast. Where else have we seen somebody standing as if slain with horns in the book of Revelation? Any guesses? We're going to narrow it. Who, at the very beginning of the book of Revelation, who's the one standing as slain? The Lamb, right? And how's the Lamb described in Revelation 5? He had horns. Now, why is the beast being described this way?
Is it Antichrist?
The opposite. He's a counterfeit.
It's a counterfeit version, right? The idea here is that God's people need to perceive the fact is that kingly, royal, or any kind of stately governmental power that is exerted in an attempt to make itself aggrandized and in the place of God himself is a counterfeit Christ. It is a counterfeit kingdom. And the temptation is to see the power, see the magnificence, see the exertion, and see that, well, they hold all the cards, they have all the power, maybe they are, right, the true God here. Maybe they are the true authority. And so, here this vision of the beast is meant to help the believer understand that the exertion of governmental power will have all the display and all the majesty and all the appearance of a divinely sanctioned authority. It will appear as if it's doing God's work, because it even appears like the Lamb in a certain way. And yet, God's people are meant to understand that this exertion of what seems to be royal power, divine power, is counterfeit, and is to be it's not embraced, not worshipped, not enjoyed. Again, this is where the language of who is like unto the beast, who can fight against it. This is kind of language that's used of God throughout the Old Testament, that here we see this beast receiving worship that is really only truly deserving of God himself. And here we see kind of this word of exhortation, verses 9 through 10, as a response to this vision. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is to be taken captive, to captivity he goes. If anyone is to be slain with the sword he must be slain. Here is a call for the endurance and faith of the saints. Now, so here this vision is really meant to be fuel for our fire in terms of how do we persevere as believers today. How does this vision kind of motivate us and encourage us and press us forward in our faithfulness, in our continual confession of the risen Christ? We'll take a look here. What do you think this exhortation is trying to tell us here when it says, if anyone is to be taken captive, to captivity he goes. If anyone is to be slain with the sword he must be slain. If this is the message of Christian faithfulness, what is this exhortation telling us about the saints' relationship to the beast? What can we expect? We can expect martyrdom. We can expect persecution at the hands of this beastly figure, which is really representing ungodly government throughout redemptive history. Whenever government seeks to take the place of God himself and compel us to worship it rather than God himself, it will mean that we must be faithful unto death if necessary. What's also interesting here is that this language is actually not unique to Revelation. It's actually coming to us. It's somewhat pretty much of a paraphrase of Jeremiah 15 verse 2. Now, why is that significant? Why is John using Jeremiah 15 verse 2 to kind of describe the nature of Christian faithfulness in the face of ungodly state-employed persecution? Well, in Jeremiah 15, here we see that what's being described, if anyone is taken captive, to captivity he goes. If anyone is slain with the sword he must be slain. This is actually describing God's people receiving the curses of having broken the covenant. You look at the context of Jeremiah 15, this suffering that's happening amongst God's people is divine judgment being employed by Babylon So does that make you uneasy for a moment here? In terms of how can John use this passage, right? If he's describing this is what Christian faithfulness looks like in the face of kind of state-endorsed persecution and compulsion, how can he use a text that's describing the judgment of God's people having broken covenant and now receiving the covenant curses? How can we kind of put those two images together?
It's a warning.
How so?
Warning not to kowtow to governmental decrees and power that is not biblical. It's not according to the word. It's a warning.
Well, it's a warning here, but if the captivity and the slaying here is happening to God's people in Jeremiah 15 as a result of their sin, then how is this a picture of Christian faithfulness today? You see the tension there? Yeah? That's kind of what I highlight here, the tension here. Well, again, in Jeremiah 15, that's not the end of the story. Later on in chapter 16, God promises that he's going to bring the entirety of God's people through this experience of judgment. But he's going to preserve a remnant and restore them when he brings them back from exile. So it's not just the unrepentant that are experiencing the covenant curses. The repentant or the faithful are experiencing them too. So the rain is falling on the righteous and the unrighteous when these curses come down in Israel. But God promises, I'll bring you through this judgment. Right? And I'll vindicate you for having experienced these judgments at the hand of an ungodly power like Babylon. Right? The narrative of Jeremiah makes clear that when Babylon administers these covenant curses, she goes too far. She appropriates these covenant curses as an agent of God's judgment, but she ascribes to herself the glory and the origin of the application of these curses. She applies them as if she's the deity who's employing these covenant curses. And now we begin to see a little bit of logic as to why John's using this text. He's saying that the nature of your persecution is going to be so compelling and the power behind it so powerful, it's going to look like you're under divine judgment. Before a watching world, you're going to look like you are the apostates of the prevailing God of this age. And even people are going to see your suffering and say, well, of course these people are unjust. Of course these people deserve the judgment. They have rebelled against the God of this age. So think about it, even when your suffering and persecution feels like it's coming from God himself, it's to remember that God will preserve you through that suffering. God will preserve you and protect you from being overcome by Satan's devices to convince you that this ungodly power is the source of your security and protection. And alongside with that, a similar kind of feature is happening with the second beast. Whereas the first beast seeks to use power, raw exertion of state power, to compel you to apostatize, the second beast will try to use persuasion. Whether it's in the form of, well, it's politically advantageous for you to apostatize. It's religiously advantageous for you to reject the gospel. It's economically advantageous for you to live into